So let's bring MMT into the mix then. So what essentially is MMT? Going on that basis of this is what money is, this is how money is made, and it is just created by the person who has the dictatorship over creating it in a society. What is MMT and how does that fit in?
Well, modern monetary theory is just a brand name for an approach to thinking about the economy and public finance that takes all that into account. The US government, and this is not just the case with the US, it's true of Australia and Canada and the UK and Japan and New Zealand and some other countries too, have governments that are a special type of currency issuer that we often refer to as a monetary sovereign. To be a monetary sovereign, you not only have to issue your own currency and collect taxes in that currency, the tax collection is important because it ensures there's always going to be a demand for that currency. Even if people want to engage in barter transactions or use cryptocurrencies, they'll always have to get US dollars because their taxes are assessed in US dollars. It's also important that the currency issuer does not guarantee to convert that currency at a fixed rate into anything which it could possibly run out of. So you have to not be on a gold standard to be a full monetary sovereign, and the US went off gold finally in August 1971. You have to not be on a fixed exchange rate against any foreign currency, and you have to not have a significant amount of foreign currency denominated debt. Now, all those things are true of the US and have been true for many years, and they've been true in Australia since the early 1980s too. So both our countries have monetary sovereign governments. If you are a monetary sovereign government, there is no financial constraint on federal government spending. There is only, as I was saying before, a real constraint or an inflation barrier that you have to be careful that you don't cross. So when you're talking about planning for a Green New Deal, for example, or whatever else the US federal government wants to plan for in the future when it's doing its budgeting, it shouldn't be focusing, as the Congressional Budget Office does at the moment, on the implications for the federal government's budget balance in the years ahead, in the next decade. That's not what they should be doing. They should always be looking at their spending plans and sure, the structure of taxation and whatever else they're going to do to limit private sector spending in the economy. And they should be comparing the implications of those plans with the productive capacity of the US economy. And as long as they don't go beyond that productive capacity and create inflation because the government and the private sector are competing for scarce real resources and driving up their prices, then it really doesn't matter what the budget balance in itself is going to be. It's inappropriate to target a particular government deficit. And we like to say that the government's deficit is just everybody else's surplus. So people can be much more relaxed when you read in the paper or online about how big the federal deficit is going to be this year. Just change that word deficit to surplus and remember that the government's deficit is your surplus. They're giving you more than they're taking away, and we can be relaxed about that. And you can also be relaxed about what they often call the national debt, which people, particularly in the US actually, seem to have virtually have a fit about when they start looking at projections for the future. The government's debt is not your debt at all. It's the debt of the currency issuer that can't run out of dollars. All it is all the dollars the federal government's ever spent into the US monetary system and hasn't yet taxed back out of the system again. That's all it is. So the issue is always, do you have the real resources? If you want to transition very rapidly towards renewables, which in the US, which has per capita based on consumption emissions of carbon dioxide at the moment of 21.2 tons, you need for that to be sustainable to get it down to 1.6 tons, which means basically you've got to get rid of all of it. So there needs to be a massive transition to renewables and electricity. There needs to be massive electrification of the US economy, and it has to happen more or less overnight, or at least within the next 10 years, and ideally within the first half of the next 10 years, if we're not going to be on the way to hothouse Earth. Because the three countries, if you can call Europe a country, that are going to determine what happens to this planet are the US and the European Union and China. And two of those three have to be taking radical action in the next 10 years. So climate scientists and Earth system scientists tell us, for us to have any hope in the future of having a world, a planet which will support the 10 or 11 billion people that we're forecast to have at some point this century. So that's more important than everything else. We need to be making rapid progress to that. It's by no means the only issue with our planetary boundaries that we're living beyond, but it's the most pressing one. Can we afford to do that? Sure, we can afford the dollars. The issue is not about the dollars, it's about the real resources. And that's where we go back to what I was saying before: ban fracking and offshore drilling, end fossil fuel subsidies, free up some real resources by slimming down the incredibly inefficient and massively expensive medical system in the US. Deal with the way the banking system and Wall Street absorbs real resources, which means dealing with some of the excessive inequality in the US. Those kind of things, you need to then look at them and say, right, what real resources can we free up? Do we have the necessary skills and technology available? If we've got shortages of skills, can we train people? What investments are we going to make? It's all about, and I know people hate words like this, not maybe listeners to your podcast perhaps, but a lot of people do. It's going to need a lot of planning and intervention by the federal government. It needs an activist government. It needs a sort of Roosevelt type of philosophy. It doesn't need the kind of philosophy that we've had in recent decades, because the neoliberalism of recent decades is not just driven us to social injustice and all the things that we could list, but it is driving us towards hothouse Earth and the potential virtual extinction of our species.
In other words, there's nothing pragmatic about an incremental solution to a catastrophic problem.
There is no incremental solution to this problem.
Exactly. No. Right. All right.
30 years ago, there would have been. If we'd done this soon after James Hansen told everybody about it. But we haven't. We've done absolutely nothing yet. Global emissions, US emissions come down a tiny bit in recent years, but global emissions, but I mean, let's face it, and you can't complain to low-income countries in Africa about their emissions going up a little bit, because they're not responsible for the problem. It's Australia and America and Britain, and we've caused the problem down through the decades, and it's been accelerating. If you're 30 years old, 50% of this has happened in your lifetime. That's the problem. And our record year for global emissions was 2019. So we haven't even got going with this yet. And that's where you're absolutely right. And we were talking a little bit about US politics before, and I won't give away what you said, but if I was not in a marginal state, I would be voting for somebody who was in favor of a genuine attempt to confront these issues. If I was in a marginal state, I'd be just making sure that Donald Trump wasn't president, because I think another 4 years, the trouble with Trump is he doesn't admit there's any problem at all. And at least Biden, you're right, there is no solution when you're talking about an incremental solution, but at least we've got to the point where somebody is grudgingly admitting there is a problem.
Isn't that sad? That's where the bar is. Isn't that disturbing? That it's like, Well, one guy says it's a thing. Whether or not he wants to do anything about it, I don't know. But he's saying it's a thing at least.
Yeah, well, the good news is that technologically we could do something about it, and the real resources exist or could be created. It will require, for some years, even post-pandemic, a significant level of deficit spending by the US government, but that's not the problem. The problem is freeing up the real resources to allow for the deficit spending, which will create loads of jobs. There's not going to be a shortage of jobs. There's plenty of. We've got an enormous amount to do, and it's going to require people, and in some cases, it's going to require training people in order to do the things which it's necessary to get done. So we're not looking at a future where there's no jobs. There's, for a long time to come anyway, there's going to be a lot of jobs because there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it's not going to be done by robots.
So let me try to, let's stick with like the Green New Deal as an example, and then kind of bring MMT back into this, and just tell me if I'm like in the ballpark with this, if I'm getting it right, if I'm getting it wrong, because this is kind of how I understood Stephanie Kelton's explanation. Like, say we go about something like a Green New Deal, employing the concepts of MMT, where, okay, we have these costs such as infrastructure, such as, electrifying the grid, windmills, whatever else, list goes on. And we put this printed money into that cost. And that is just basically a sunk cost. We just paid for it because we printed the money and we just did it. Then we
never say printed, but yes.
Oh, right. Okay. All right. Yeah. Create, right? Is create the right. Okay. So create the money,
that's fine.
And then it's paid for. So that's just paid for. That's just out. That money's not in circulation now. It's not there. But what is in circulation is all the jobs.
Yeah, the money's in circulation still. People, if you pay people, they're going to spend it. It's going to end up in somebody else's bank account.
But that's where the jobs come.
Some of it you're going to tax back. But yeah, so the issue is, first of all, do you have the necessary skills and resources to do the things that you want to do? And then secondly, do you have the necessary real resources while you're living within our planetary boundaries to provide the goods and services that people are going to buy while receiving that income? Those are the things that you have to take into account. And it's a tricky problem. You have to look at all the different pay-fors, all the ways in which you can free up resources. And it may well be that if the investments that you intend to make are very high because you need to make a dramatic transition, I'm not going to promise that it's not going to be necessary at some stage to raise some taxes. But if you do raise taxes, the role of those taxes is to limit inflation. It's not to pay for anything. And so whether you need higher taxes or not involves you looking at the real resource implications and the degree of spare capacity that exists in the economy, in the important sectors, the real resource implications of your spending plans. You then have to get down into the nitty-gritty of the consumer price index or whatever measure of inflation you're looking at, and look at issues like monopoly power and pricing. And if once you've done all that, once you've looked at all the pay-fors that you can come up with, once you've looked at the resources that are available, if you still think your plans are inflationary, then don't make any apology for having to raise taxes if that's necessary in order to limit inflation. But, and this may shock people, it may not be, because there are lots of ifs there, and it involves people doing the sort of detailed research that people like Stephanie and her colleagues are doing, and I'm not possibly well informed enough about the US to comment on in detail. Taxes are important. Taxes create a demand for the US dollar in the first place. That's why a monetary sovereign has to have an efficient tax system in place. After that, taxes are one of the ways of limiting inflationary pressure in the economy if you do get towards the productive capacity and start to drive inflation up. And then, of course, we've got other purposes for taxes too. I'd be taxing rich people because they're too rich. They've got too much power.
I'm
The
with
good
you.
news from MMT is you don't need their money. You don't really need them either. You don't need their money. And we've got some billionaire miners in Australia. And I often say to people, if we tax them more and they say they're going to leave the country, fine, I'll drive them to the airport. If that happens, you don't need their.
You know what you should do, Stephen?
money.
You should tell them you'll drive them to the airport, and then at the last minute, be like, you know what? I changed my mind. Take the frickin' train. You can hear it right outside. I don't want to drive you. Take the train.
And
Go
they'd
to
have to jump.
Melbourne.
They'd have to jump on as well because it's a freight train, so they have to sit on the back.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your news